Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This time I wanted to have a little discussion video. I wanted to talk a little bit about what brought you into comic books. Just wanted to really focus in on just the early days of collecting for me, and just curious to see what you have to say in the comments about what brought you in and so forth. So anyway, what brought me into collecting comics is this book right here. But this is the book that really brought me into collecting comics. I was a big fan of the HBO series, as you all know. You know, I love my ECs and all that stuff. So I went looking to buy EC Comics in Woodbridge Mall, and this had just come out. So the guy said, "Hey, we got this." Now this is I have a couple copies of this. This is more of my reader copy, but it's a double-size issue. So not only the company Gladstone, they were putting out EC reprints. In the early 90s, there were a lot of EC reprints coming out. You had Gemstone, you had Gladstone, you had a bunch of others that I don't even know off the top of my head, that I don't even remember. But this is the one that I think about the most, Gladstone. So anyway, I purchased this. And the first story, I went looking to see if I could find stories that I saw on the HBO series. I was like, oh, well, they did cutting cards, so maybe they have cutting cards in this. And no, I didn't find too many of those in the reprints. There were some in these reprints, and I'll talk about the other ones too, like the Vault of Horror and so forth, but not many. So I started reading material that I was unfamiliar with, and I started really getting into it. So not only was I trying to buy all of these that came out every month, eventually I found out about the Vault of Horror and the Haunt of Fear in reprint form. I saw these advertisements, the magazine forms, which I got. I remember, I'll never forget. I got the Tales from the Crypt one when my father had a business trip to Baltimore, Washington. He went to Baltimore, and we went to the Capitol and all that stuff. And I went to a mall there, and I got a couple of these, some Vault of Horrors, and that one right there. I was always looking for this one, so it brings back a lot of great memories for me. Oh, excuse me, not this one. That was the one I got. Got a little ahead of myself. I was always looking for that one. So sorry about that. But anyway, I started reading material that I was unfamiliar with. I was looking to read the material that was on the screen, and it wasn't readily available, or at least to me. And reading the other stuff other than what was on the screen made me a fan. And the first story was Undertaking Pallor. And this, they would show like little snapshots of art from other issues. This is actually from a story called Dead Right. There were two stories called Dead Right. One that was on the second season of HBO, the first premiere episode with Demi Moore and Jeffrey Tambor. That was based on a shock suspense story 6 story. And then there was another story called Dead Right from Tales from the Crypt 37. They used that story for the HBO series in season 3, but they renamed it Abracadabra, with Tony Goldwyn and Beau Bridges. Really, that was a great one too. But that's from there. That's from Dead Right, when the experiment goes wrong. That face right there. This face right here is from my favorite cover, Haunt of Fear 12, Poetic Justice. But anyway, reading the original material was great. And it was 2 issues in one. Here you have the first. This was based off this one right here, is Tales from the Crypt 39. And then they did a double issue. Like I said, all these were double-size issues. And the other issue in this was Crime Suspense Stories #1. So it gave you a whole load of stuff. It gave you horror, it gave you crime, some of them even gave you sci-fi. So that was the comic that really made me a fan of collecting. And I went back every month to try to find these. And this was only a limited series, and then when it was over, it was over. But I remember reading the fan pages on this, and they were talking about previous issues, like #1 and #2. Lower Berth and #1. Lower Berth was on the TV show, so naturally I wanted that, but I could never find #1. That was until Patrick, I think a couple years ago now, bought me this for Christmas, I believe. Merry Christmas. So he was nice enough. It was the first time I actually got this issue. I've never had it, and it was really cool to see. I mean, I have the original Tales from the Crypt that this one's based off of, which is 33. I never had the Gladstone reprint of #1. I remember when I was reading that when I was a kid, I would have loved to have had this one. I went looking for it in back issues, and I never found it. And another one I was really I really wanted back then was #2 because it had Midnight Mess, and this is Tales from the Crypt 35, but reprinted as #2 for Gladstone. So a lot of great memories back then of trying to find books and going back every month. And I remember this one right here when I discovered Vault of Horror. I've always liked the blue backgrounds, and here they redid, there's some color differences in this cover from the original one, which is #23. But I remember I got this a few months after I got #3, because I think so, a few months after I got #3. And I remember reading this. My family were at Roy Rogers at the time, so it was a Friday night, November 16th. Never forget that. So that's what really kept me, really brought me into the hobby. But after that mini series ended, I think they only went up to 6. I just stood away for about a year, and then the X-Men cartoon came on, and started looking for some of those. Like with Tales from the Crypt, I was going to buy the comics to see if I could see what I saw on the screen in the book. Did the same thing for X-Men, and my very first X-Men issue right here. Now, this is not the original one. I had sold that off a few years ago. It was a 5.0 copy, but this is a very high-grade copy, about 9.4, 9.6. I was lucky to upgrade several years ago, and of course I upgraded the other one too. So these were the first 2 superhero books that I was able to get when I decided to really start collecting comics. So anyway, I remember about this. One of the problems I had with reading comics back then was because it was hard for me to follow sometimes back then. It was hard for me to read and follow along because I got bored very quickly with things. And I was afraid that was going to be the case with this, but I made sure I read every line, and I didn't regret it. I really got into it. So flash forward years later, I was reading this and started collecting more and more. I became a big fan of Chris Claremont because he wrote this, and he wrote many of the issues that I liked and so forth. When I attended my first con after being out of the hobby for a while, I met Chris Claremont, and I had him sign a book. It wasn't this one, obviously, but I had him sign a book, and I told him, hey, this was the very first book I read, and he's joked around about it with me and so forth. He was very pleasant. I think he's usually pleasant with people, but he was very pleasant with me, and he joked around about it with me. It was a nice small con, so you were able to talk to him for a little bit before you had to go off. So that was really cool, and it was a really cool day to meet somebody that wrote one of your favorite storylines and wrote about some of your favorite characters when you became a comic book collector. One of my goals, I remember back in the day when I was reading these and collecting other books and so forth, what I really wanted, there were a lot of books I really wanted. Some were more in my capabilities of getting than others. Always wanted X-Men 94, and if you could ask even Patrick Luther Manning and so forth, and his friend Mike, he said back in the 80s, and even Dr. Von Schiller, I think back in the 80s, X-Men 94 was the book to have, over Giant Size X-Men #1, if you could believe that. I've always thought, well, people want first appearances, right? I mean, people collect other things too, but for a large part, a lot of us do collect first appearances. We'll get the Giant Size. But it was this book here that a lot of people were chasing. And in a lot of cases, I think, was more expensive than the Giant Size. Not the case today by a long shot. But I remember back then, man, even I wanted it. But I wanted Giant Size more, but this would have been a great book to have. I loved the cover. This was so cool. I thought it was great. And it introduced these new X-Men into the series, because the series was dead for about 5 years. It was doing reprints, and people didn't even know that X-Men were coming back unless, I guess, you saw this on the stands or you were getting Foom in the mail. that introduced the new characters before the Giant Size came out. So that must have been a real exciting time back in '75 to see that after 5 years, since 1970, that the X-Men were coming back with new stories and a brand new team and so forth. And, starting with Chris Claremont, right? Writing all of this, and some great work by Dave Cochran and John Byrne that came, and so many others that worked on this title in the early days, and dished out some really memorable storylines, including the Starjammers, the Dark Phoenix, and Inferno, and all those other things that came along the way. But I remember this is one that I really, really wanted, and eventually I was able to get it. I had several copies of this over the years, but that was what was important to me when it came to comic collecting. The books that I first started reading, which was horror. That's why I always have a soft spot in my heart for EC books. It's not everyone's cup of tea. It's not just EC. A lot of people don't have, it's pre-code and all that stuff is not necessarily something that people like for various reasons. I'm not going to get into it in this particular episode, but a lot of people like the superhero books, and I can understand why. But when it comes to what I first started, what got me into the hobby and kept me in the hobby were some of the things that I talked about today and some of the things I've shown today. Well, tell me what brought you in. Was it did you like to collect stuff? Were you an avid reader? Did you like movies? Did you like collecting cards? Did you like just the artwork? Were you in it for the money? Collecting and flipping and so forth? Everyone collects differently. It's no big deal. Pretty cool, no matter what. But what brought you in? What keeps you in today? Thank you for watching.